I'm David Lombardino, Editor-in-Chief of DLA Editors and Proofers, here to talk to you about how to write an outstanding personal statement. Today, I'd like specifically to talk to you about red flags and whether to talk about them in your personal statement, and if so, how. I'd like to start off with providing a few examples. First example of a red flag would be a poor test score or a failed attempt on a test. Say, for example, on the USMLE STEP test, MCAT, LSAT, or GRE. Second is going to be a low GPA or poor academic performance. And we see this generally coming up in one of two ways. So the first way would be whether you consistently receive lower grades or lower scores in one subject compared to the rest. For example, chemistry compared to biology. Another way we see this coming up is if there's a specific period of time during which your academic performance suffered. This could be, for example, if you had an ailing family member that you needed to tend to, or if you had your own health issues to overcome, and you needed to take time away from your studies and your grades suffered as a result. Next red flag I'd like to talk about, or provide as an example, is a lack of relevant experience. So say, for example, you're applying for law school, but you've never set foot inside of a courtroom or inside of a law office. That would be a red flag. The next two types of red flags that I am going to provide as examples are related to each other. So the first is going to be professionalism issues, and the second is going to be disciplinary action. Let's say, for example, that you've been put on academic or another type of probation, or you've been asked to resign from a program. Those would be red flags. Finally, the last group of examples that I want to provide relates specifically to applying to medical residency. And those could be graduating from medical school outside the United States, graduating more than 2 years ago since medical school, having a gap in training, or a previous failure to match. Now, when it comes to thinking about red flags and the question of whether to address these in the personal statement, and if so, how, I'd like to provide three examples from the real world that we can use as a lens for viewing this question. So the first example is going to be somebody with a heavy accent when speaking English. Let's call him John. John's learning English as a second language, and he's aware of his heavy accent when speaking. Perhaps he's been in situations where people could not understand him clearly or misunderstood him. He's self-conscious about it, and in certain situations, he finds himself embarrassed. And he's going to a party where there's going to be a lot of people and all of them are talking in English. So, like the red flags, the fact of his having a heavy accent in English is something that he cannot avoid. It exists, and the question then becomes, what does he do about it? So, he's at the party. He has three options. He can either not talk at all so that nobody hears his heavy accent, or if he does talk, he can limit what he says to just a few words. So, to limit his exposure, or the exposure of his heavy accent, to the notice of others. His third option would be to say, hey, look, my character as a person, my value as a person is not determined by whether I have an accent when speaking English. And then he puts his embarrassment or his self-consciousness aside and speaks freely. Now, in the first two cases, everybody is going to feed off or feel his embarrassment or self-consciousness about his accent. And in the third case, it's going to be deflated. Their embarrassment or their self-consciousness that they feel from him is going to go away, and they're going to feel comfortable and confident around him in the same way that he is comfortable and confident. In other words, he takes away from them the opportunity to think negatively about him because of his thick accent in English. Second example is similar to that. There's a girl, let's call her Sarah, and she's been invited to a party. She understands that it's a casual party, and so she gets on a blouse, a pair of pants, she goes to the party. And when she arrives, she finds everybody in cocktail dresses. How does she respond? Well, when she walks in the door, everybody sees what she's wearing. Everybody knows that she's wearing something different than the attire of everybody else. Like a red flag, it's not anything that she can pretend doesn't exist. It does exist, everybody knows it. How does she respond? Does she run away from the party and never return? Does she race home to change her clothes and then come back? Or does she say, hey, look, my character and my value as a person is not determined by the fact that today I happen to make a mistake in what I wore to the party? And then does she put that aside and go attend the party freely? As in the case of the prior example with the accent, either of the first two options is going to increase or embellish the embarrassment or self-consciousness that is projected from her onto the others. But in the third case, just saying, hey, look, I'm here to have a good time. I'm not going to be embarrassed about the fact that I happen to wear the wrong outfit today. That's going to deflate or actually remove the embarrassment and self-consciousness from the people around her. They're going to feel comfortable and confident around her. She's going to feel comfortable and confident. Everybody's going to have a good time. The third example that I'd like to provide is a quite simple one, which is having a blemish. Everybody's got them. I've got blemishes. Everybody else has blemishes. There's no way to hide them. Well, you could try putting on makeup, but the fact is that they're going to continue to exist. And even if you do try to hide them, perhaps in the attempt to hide them, it actually makes them more noticeable. Perhaps because you're still embarrassed by them, or you're self-conscious about them, or your actual attempt to hide it makes it more noticeable than it would otherwise be. So you go to a party. You've got a blemish on your face. Do you try to hide that blemish from other people? Do you try to angle your face away? Again, that attempt to hide it is going to be something that actually makes the situation worse. Notice the word hide. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. What's your other option? You can say, hey, look, my value as a person, my character as a person is not determined by whether I have a blemish. And that's what I want you to understand about red flags, which is that you can't control them. Many people, if not everybody, has them. And the question then becomes, what is the effect if you don't talk about it in a personal statement? And that effect is quite simple. If the red flag is known and you don't talk about it, it communicates the idea that you're trying to hide something. And if you're trying to hide something that everybody knows, what more are you trying to hide that perhaps we don't know about? Another way of looking at it is, if you don't talk about a red flag in a personal statement, you leave open the possibility for the program director or admissions committee member to interpret that red flag in whatever manner they wish. So for example, poor academic performance. Well, maybe you got poor academic performance because you were playing video games all the time. I mean, they could think that. Well, it would be less to your benefit and more to your detriment for them to think that you were playing video games all the time than for them to think that you had an ailing family member that you spent 20 hours a week or 30 hours a week tending to. There's a big difference there. And so the reason why you do want to talk about a red flag in a personal statement is to take control of how that red flag is interpreted. And it's also an opportunity for you to take control of how you're presenting yourself and to show the program that even though you have a red flag and everybody knows you have a red flag, you have nothing to hide. Now, specifically for the applications for medical residency, ECFMG has this to say about addressing red flags in a personal statement, which is absolutely do address red flags in a personal statement. And when you do so, be honest, be accurate, and be forthright. And when you do so, a funny thing will happen. Think about the three examples that I gave earlier about John with a heavy accent, Sarah showing up at the party inappropriately dressed, or simply having a blemish. The people who are most attractive are the ones who are not self-conscious, who are not embarrassed, particularly about blemishes or mistakes that anybody can make, or that are ones outside of their control. And the same is true for applying for medical residency or any other type of program. That when you own up to your red flag or red flags, you present them honestly, accurately, and in a forthright manner. In other words, you present them confidently, but with a touch of humility. You make yourself a lot more appealing to the programs. I hope this helped you think about this question of red flags and whether to address them in a personal statement, and if so, how. We offer a full range of services for personal statements, from proofreading to revision and critique to consultation. Come see what we have to offer at www.dlaeditors.com.